Hi there. I am so happy you found your way to Starlet Sinister tonight. I know you are here to escape the noise, so here is my promise. Only few short ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, silence. The rest of the video is completely ad-free so you can sleep undisturbed. I've dug deep to bring you fresh stories that you won't find anywhere else. I wanted to bring you something real. If that sounds good to you, a sub would help me a lot. Before you close your eyes, let me know one thing in the comments. What is the weather like outside your window right now? I love imagining where you all are listening from. Now, get comfortable. Let the dark in. Here is story number 1. A faint ticking came from the heater, not loud enough to matter, just steady enough to notice. Although I was half focused on my notes, the sound kept pulling my attention back to the room. Restless and worn down, the habit of staying awake too late felt normal to me then. Quietly, I rubbed my eyes and waited for the building to settle the way it always did at night. Against the tall windows of the archive office, rain pressed softly, more like breath than weather. While most people in town were asleep, my job kept me sitting with old records and quiet machines. Tired but stubborn, I liked working these hours because no one asked questions. Slowly, the lights above me hummed, and the place felt sealed off from the rest of the world. The town was small, tucked near the coast in Nova Scotia, the kind of place that forgot itself after dark. Because winter had stretched longer than usual, everyone felt a little closed in. Used to being alone, I found comfort in rooms that didn't expect anything from me. Softly, the clock on the wall marked time without caring who noticed. On that night, I wasn't looking for anything strange. Although the box in front of me was labeled with a familiar street name, I didn't think much of it. Careful and slow, I opened the lid and sorted through folded papers and faded photos. The file smelled faintly of dust and old glue. Among the documents was a thin notebook, its cover worn smooth by hands long gone. While flipping through it, I noticed the writing didn't follow any clear order. Uneven and cramped, the notes felt more like thoughts than records. Gently, I turned the pages, aware of how quiet the room had become. The notebook belonged to a man named Harold Ives, a name I recognized from town stories. Because my role involved organizing personal archives, I had seen his name before. Known for keeping to himself, Harold had lived near the water most of his life. Quietly, I wondered why his private notebook had ended up here. The first few pages talked about weather, work, and ordinary days. Although nothing stood out at first, there was a heaviness to the writing. Measured and careful, every sentence felt weighed down. Slowly, I reached a page where the tone shifted. He wrote about a night when the house felt too full. While reading, I noticed my shoulders tense without meaning to. Unsettled but curious, I kept going. Softly, the rain outside seemed to match the pace of my breath. Harold described sitting alone in his living room listening to the wind move around the house. Because his wife had passed years earlier, the place had grown quiet in ways he hadn't expected. Used to noise and movement, the stillness bothered him more than he admitted. Gently, he wrote about missing the sound of another person breathing nearby. The next lines were shorter, almost rushed. Although he didn't name what he felt, fear sat between the words. Careful and restrained, he avoided details. Slowly, I leaned closer, as if the page might whisper something extra. He mentioned a window near the back of the house. While that detail alone meant nothing, he returned to it again and again. Persistent and uneasy, his focus stayed fixed there. Quietly, I glanced toward the archive windows without thinking. Outside, the rain had thickened, blurring the streetlights into pale smears. Because the office sat empty at night, reflections filled the glass. Distracted and tired, I mistook my own shape for something else for a moment. Softly, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Back in the notebook, Harold wrote about standing up and checking the locks. Although nothing had changed, he felt the need to be sure. Tense and alert, he described the feeling as waiting for a sound that never came. Slowly, his handwriting grew tighter. He wrote that grief made him careless. While reading that line, I felt an odd sting of recognition. Ashamed and honest, the sentence stood alone on the page. Quietly, I turned to the next one. There, he wrote about wanting to see someone again. Because he never used a name, the absence felt intentional. Careful and guarded, he avoided explaining why. Gently, the pen mark pressed deeper into the paper. The office felt colder as I read. Although the heater still ticked, the warmth seemed to fade. Distracted and uneasy, I shifted in my chair. Slowly, I reminded myself that these were just old words. Harold described the house feeling watched. While he never claimed to see anything, the sense lingered. Heavy and slow, the sentences dragged. Quietly, I noticed the rain had stopped outside. The pause in weather made the silence sharper. Because sound carried more in quiet moments, every small noise stood out. Restless and alert, I found myself listening instead of reading. Softly, a pipe clicked somewhere in the walls. Back in the notebook, Harold wrote a single line that made my chest tighten. Although it was simple, it carried weight. Careful and deliberate, he wrote that some visits are mistakes. Slowly, I reread it to be sure. He didn't explain what he meant. While that frustrated me, it also felt intentional. Restrained and distant, the words stopped short. Quietly, the page ended there. I sat back and stared at the notebook. Because my job was to catalog, not feel, this reaction surprised me. Uneasy and distracted, I checked the time without thinking. Softly, the clock answered with a dull click. The next page began days later, at least according to the date. Although he avoided writing about what happened, the change was clear. Guarded and tight, his tone shifted again. Slowly, I sensed that something had been left out on purpose. He wrote about closing curtains earlier than usual. While that seemed harmless, he returned to it often. Methodical and careful, the habit became routine. Quietly, I imagined the house growing darker each evening. Outside the archive, the streetlight flickered once. Because the glass reflected the room behind me, the movement startled me. Tense and embarrassed, I shook my head at myself. Softly, I reminded myself where I was. Harold wrote that night, air no longer felt friendly. Although he once loved leaving windows open, he stopped. Protective and cautious, he framed it as common sense. Slowly, his world seemed to shrink. The notebook ended without warning. While I expected some conclusion, there wasn't one. Abrupt and unfinished, the last page felt torn away. Quietly, I closed the cover. Holding it in my hands, I felt like I had stepped into someone else's waiting. Because nothing dramatic had happened, the unease felt worse. Unresolved and lingering, the feeling stayed. Softly, I placed the notebook back in the box. The office lights hummed again, louder now that I noticed them. Although everything looked the same, the room felt altered. Restless and unsure, I gathered my things. Slowly, I stood and turned toward the windows. Rain had started again, light and steady. While watching it slide down the glass, I thought about unfinished thoughts. Distracted and tired, I wondered what Harold chose not to write. Quietly, I reached for my coat. Something about the reflection held my gaze a moment too long. Because nothing stood behind me, the feeling made no sense. Uneasy and alert, I turned fully around. Softly, the empty office stared back. I told myself it was just a long night and too much reading. Although that explanation fit, it didn't settle me. Careful and slow, I switched off the desk lamp. Quietly, the room fell into shadow. The notebook stayed on my mind as I locked the office door. While stepping into the hallway, the sense of waiting followed. Uncomfortable and unfinished, the night felt stretched thin. Slowly, I realized this story hadn't reached its quiet point yet. The hallway outside the archive smelled faintly of old paint and damp coats. Although I'd walked it hundreds of times, that night it felt longer. Tired and distracted, my steps echoed louder than usual. Quietly, I listened for something I couldn't name. At the end of the hall, the exit sign glowed dull red. While moving toward it, I thought about Harold's careful handwriting. Uneasy and thoughtful, I kept picturing the way his notes avoided certain words. Slowly, the idea of gaps began to bother me more than what was written. Outside, the cold settled into my jacket right away. Because winter clung to the town late that year, the air carried a sharp edge. Used to shrugging it off, I found myself pausing instead. Softly, the door shut behind me with a hollow sound. The parking lot was empty, slick with rain. Although streetlights lined the road, their glow felt weak. Distracted and tense, I glanced toward the archive windows. Quietly, nothing moved inside. On the walk home, the town felt asleep in layers. While houses sat dark and still, the ocean wind whispered through side streets, restless and alert. I kept my hands buried deep in my pockets. Slowly, my thoughts drifted back to the notebook again. Harold hadn't written about seeing anything. Because of that, the fear in his words felt heavier. Careful and deliberate, he had circled around something unseen. Quietly, I wondered if he'd done that to protect himself. My apartment was above a closed bakery, small and familiar. Although the place usually felt safe, that night it felt too open. Tired and uneasy, I locked the door and checked it twice. Softly, the old wood creaked under my hand. Inside, the heater struggled against the cold. While it rattled to life, I hung up my coat. Distracted and worn down, I left the lights low. Slowly, shadows filled the corners of the room. I made tea out of habit, not need. Because routine helped me settle, I focused on the small steps. Careful and quiet, I waited for the kettle to click off. Softly, steam rose and vanished. Sitting at the small table, I thought about grief. Although Harold never named his loss in the notebook, it pressed through every page, heavy and close. It felt familiar in a way I didn't like. Quietly, I took a sip and stared at nothing. My own loss wasn't recent, but it never fully left. While time dulled the sharp edges, it left hollow spots behind. Ashamed and honest, I admitted that I sometimes wish for signs too. Slowly, the thought made my stomach tighten. The idea unsettled me enough that I stood up. Because sitting still made the room feel smaller, I paced instead. Restless and alert, I moved toward the window. Quietly, rain tapped the glass. The street below was empty. Although reflections filled the window, I leaned closer. Distracted and cautious, I scanned the dark shapes. Softly, my breath fogged the glass. Nothing stood there. While that should have eased me, it didn't. Uneasy and tense, I stepped back. Slowly, I pulled the curtain closed. Harold's words about closing curtains earlier replayed in my mind. Because habits often hide fear, the thought lingered. Careful and restrained, he'd framed it as sense. Quietly, I wondered what made him start. Sleep didn't come easily. Although I lay down, my thoughts stayed sharp. Restless and tired, I listened to the building settle. Softly, pipes knocked somewhere below. At some point, I got up again. Because the room felt too quiet, movement felt safer. Distracted and uneasy, I walked the length of the apartment. Quietly, I checked the window latch. The metal felt cold. While holding it, a strange thought surfaced. Uncomfortable and slow, I realized Harold might have felt relief at first too. Softly, I let go. Back in bed, the notebook stayed with me. Although I hadn't brought it home, its presence felt close. Lingering and unresolved, the story pressed in. Quietly, I stared at the ceiling. Harold had written about waiting. Because waiting stretches time, the idea bothered me. Tense and thoughtful, I imagined nights passing without rest. Slowly, the image settled uncomfortably. Rain eased into a light drizzle. While the change softened the soundscape, it sharpened my awareness. Alert and strained, I noticed every shift. Softly, I turned onto my side. The thought came uninvited. Although I tried to dismiss it, it stayed. Careful and quiet, I wondered what Harold had felt when the house stopped feeling empty. Slowly, my chest tightened. I told myself I was projecting. Because long nights do that, the excuse made sense. Distracted and weary, I focused on breathing. Quietly, minutes stretched. Somewhere near morning, I drifted into shallow sleep. Although rest came, it felt thin. Uneasy and light, my dreams stayed close to the surface. Softly, sounds pulled me back again. I woke to silence. While the heater sat still, the room felt paused. Alert and unsure, I listened. Quietly, nothing answered. Sitting up, I checked the window without meaning to. Because the curtain was still closed, relief flickered briefly. Tense and thoughtful, I stayed still. Slowly, the feeling passed but didn't leave. The day crept in pale and gray. Although morning usually reset things, this one didn't. Lingering and dull, the unease stayed. Quietly, I got dressed for work. Back at the archive, the notebook waited where I'd left it. While opening the box again, my hands felt heavier. Careful and slow, I hesitated. Softly, I wondered if some things were meant to stay closed. The room smelled different in daylight, less like dust and more like paper warmed by weak sun. Although the windows let in gray light, it didn't reach the corners. Tired and cautious, I sat back down instead of opening the notebook right away. Quietly, my fingers rested on the lid. Across the room, shelves stood in neat rows. While I tried to focus on routine tasks, my attention kept slipping. Distracted and uneasy, I found myself listening again. Softly, the building made its small daytime sounds. Eventually, I opened the notebook. Because leaving it untouched felt worse, I forced myself. Careful and slow, I flipped to the last page I'd read. Quietly, the paper whispered under my fingers. The writing didn't continue the way I expected. Although dates moved forward, the content grew thinner. Guarded and clipped, Harold wrote less and less. Slowly, the pages emptied of detail. He mentioned walks cut short. While the notes were brief, the pattern stood out. Protective and restrained, he avoided being out after dusk. Quietly, I felt a dull ache of recognition. One line stopped me. Because it felt heavier than the rest, I read it twice. Careful and deliberate, he wrote that waiting can feel louder than noise. Slowly, my throat tightened. The sentence sat alone. Although he didn't explain, it carried weight. Unfinished and bare, it felt like a warning. Quietly, I closed the notebook again. Around me, the archive stayed still. While nothing had changed, the sense of being watched returned. Uneasy and alert, I shifted in my chair. Softly, I reminded myself where I was. The workday moved on in small motions. Because tasks demanded attention, I tried to give it. Distracted and tense, I kept checking the time. Quietly, hours blurred together. When evening crept in, the light faded fast. Although the day hadn't been long, it felt stretched thin. Worn and restless, I packed up earlier than usual. Slowly, the archive emptied around me. Before leaving, I looked back at the box. Because something felt unfinished, my steps slowed. Careful and hesitant, I stood there longer than needed. Quietly, I wondered if Harold had felt this pull too. Outside, the cold had sharpened again. While clouds hung low, the air felt heavy. Distracted and uneasy, I walked home slower. Softly, the town settled into evening. Lights flicked on in windows as I passed. Although each house looked ordinary, the repetition felt strange. Alert and thoughtful, I noticed how many curtains were already drawn. Quietly, the pattern stayed with me. At my apartment, I paused before unlocking the door. Because habit told me to listen first, I did. Careful and still, I waited. Softly, only the hum of the street answered. Inside, the space felt smaller than before. While nothing had moved, the air felt close. Restless and tired, I set my bag down. Quietly, I avoided looking at the window. Dinner went untouched. Although hunger should have been there, it wasn't. Distracted and dull, I sat at the table anyway. Slowly, shadows stretched across the floor. The notebook's phrases replayed without warning. Because they never explained themselves, they lingered. Uncomfortable and quiet, the thoughts circled. Softly, I rubbed my temples. Eventually, I stood and faced the window. Although I didn't want to, avoidance felt worse. Careful and tense, I pulled the curtain back a few inches. Quietly, the street stared back. Nothing stood there. While relief came, it felt thin. Uneasy and alert, I held my breath. Slowly, I let the curtain fall again. That night, sleep hovered just out of reach. Because my mind refused to settle, I stayed awake. Restless and strained, I listened to the building. Quietly, every sound felt closer. At some point, a thought surfaced that I didn't invite. Although I pushed against it, it stayed. Careful and slow, I wondered if waiting changes a place. Softly, the idea rooted itself. The archive notebook wasn't about seeing something. While that should have mattered, it didn't. Lingering and heavy, the fear lived in absence. Quietly, I understood that. Near the window, the glass creaked faintly as the temperature shifted. Because the sound was small, it shouldn't have mattered. Alert and frozen, I stared at the dark. Slowly, my pulse steadied. Nothing followed. Although silence returned, it felt altered. Unfinished and watchful, the night held on. Quietly, I stayed awake, listening for something that never arrived. The sound that pulled me back wasn't loud enough to name, just present enough to notice. A sense of unfinished business sat heavy in my chest as I unlocked the archive door again that evening. Worn down by another poor night of sleep, routine felt thinner than usual. Careful not to rush, I stepped inside and let the door close behind me. Light from the hallway spilled across the floor in dull stripes. Since the building emptied early during winter, the quiet came fast. Unsettling in a way I couldn't explain, the silence felt prepared. My coat stayed on longer than it should have. The box with Harold Ives's name waited where I'd left it. Even though it hadn't moved, my body reacted as if it had. Tight in the shoulders, I stood there longer than needed. A breath slipped out before I realized I'd been holding it. That notebook hadn't shown me anything clear. Still, the weight of it followed me through the day. Uncomfortable in a slow, dull way, the feeling didn't ask for attention. It simply stayed. I sat down and opened the box again. Habit told me to catalog and move on. Uneasy with that thought, my hands hesitated. The lid came off anyway. Pages shifted softly under my fingers. Reading them again didn't change the words. Different this time. The space between sentences stood out more. Those gaps felt intentional. Harold never described a face. He never described a voice either. Careful with omission, he left space where details should have been. That choice felt louder than description. One page carried a small note in the margin. Written lighter than the rest, it almost blended in. Strained and thoughtful, I leaned closer. The words mentioned patience without comfort. That line stayed with me longer than it should have. Patience usually suggests hope. Here, it felt like endurance, a waiting without reward. The archive clock ticked somewhere behind me. Each second landed heavier than the last. Distracted by the sound, I glanced back. Nothing had changed. A strange thought surfaced. What if Harold had learned something he couldn't unlearn? Unsettling in its simplicity, the idea settled fast. Some knowledge doesn't arrive loudly. Outside, dust pressed against the windows. Winter light faded early, leaving shapes unfinished. Tense in a quiet way, I noticed reflections building in the glass. They layered the room without permission. My own shape looked unfamiliar for a moment. That didn't frighten me. What bothered me was how easy it felt to accept. Recognition came slower than expected. Harold wrote once about familiarity being dangerous. I hadn't noticed that line before. Subtle and buried, it blended into routine notes. Now it stood out. Familiar things don't ask questions. They don't warn. They invite. The thought settled wrong. The building made a small settling sound, metal contracting somewhere deep in the walls. Alert but calm, I waited for it to repeat. It didn't. My body reacted before my thoughts did. Muscles tightened. Posture shifted. Listening took over. The silence that followed felt thicker. Not louder, just present, as if something had leaned closer. I told myself it was fatigue. Lack of sleep plays tricks. That explanation usually worked. This time, it didn't settle. The notebook lay open in front of me. Its pages didn't move. Nothing marked the moment. Still, something felt acknowledged. Harold's later notes avoided certain rooms. He never said why. The pattern was enough. Avoidance became a language. I wondered which room he stopped using first. The thought lingered. Bedrooms hold too much vulnerability. Living rooms, remember. My gaze drifted to the archive windows again. Reflections layered the shelves and tables, hard to tell where glass ended and room began. The boundary felt thin. A memory surfaced that wasn't mine. Harold standing still. Lights low. Waiting for something to decide. The idea unsettled me enough to stand. Sitting felt exposed. Movement gave shape to time. I walked the length of the room. Each step echoed softly. Sound behaved differently at night. Distance stretched. Presence felt closer. Near the window, the temperature changed, not colder, just different. Air shifted without warning. My reflection met me again. This time, I didn't look away. Something about holding eye contact felt important. Grounding. Nothing else appeared. No movement behind me. No shape in the glass. Relief came slowly. Still, I stepped back. Instinct asked for space. Distance felt safer. The curtain stayed open. Harold had written about that choice too, not closing something on purpose, a test maybe, or defiance. The archive clock ticked again. Time resumed its usual rhythm. My breathing followed. The moment loosened, yet the feeling didn't leave entirely. It settled deeper, quiet, patient. I closed the notebook without marking the page. Some things didn't need reference. They stayed accessible on their own. Memory handles that work. Packing up took longer than usual. Each motion felt deliberate. I didn't rush. Rushing felt careless. Before leaving, I turned the lights off one by one. Darkness filled the room in sections, orderly, predictable. At the door, I paused, listening again, waiting for confirmation. None came. The quiet followed me into the hallway. It didn't chase. It didn't press. It simply remained present. Something about that felt worse than fear. The hallway lights hummed with a tired sound. Fluorescent tubes always felt half awake. That night, the noise felt closer to breathing. I slowed without meaning to. My footsteps didn't echo the same way they had earlier. Sound fell short, like the building absorbed it. Uncomfortable with the change, I adjusted my pace. Nothing corrected itself. A door farther down the hall stood slightly open. I didn't remember leaving it that way. Maintenance sometimes did. The explanation arrived too easily. From inside that room came a colder draft, not strong enough to be a breeze, just enough to notice on bare skin. I stopped walking. Waiting felt familiar now. The notebook had trained me for it. Harold's long pauses lived in my body. I listened the way he must have. No voices came. No footsteps followed. The building stayed quiet. The door stayed open. Curiosity edged past caution. Not bravado, just the need to resolve something unfinished. I moved closer. The room held old shelving and surplus boxes. Nothing personal, nothing meaningful, a place no one lingered. Light from the hallway barely reached inside. Shadows pooled behind stacked crates. Depth felt exaggerated. Distance lost accuracy. I didn't step fully inside. Thresholds matter more than people admit. Crossing them changes expectations. I stayed where I was. The air inside the room felt held, not stale, contained, as if waiting for release. My breath sounded too loud. I controlled it. Slower in, careful out. Nothing reacted, no movement, no sound. Still, the room felt aware. That thought startled me more than it should have. Awareness implies attention. Attention implies choice. I stepped back. The door didn't move. It stayed open at the same angle. No creak, no correction. Leaving it that way felt wrong. Closing it felt worse. The choice carried weight. I chose distance instead. Back in the main hallway, the quiet followed. Not aggressively, not closely, just present. The exit sign glowed ahead. Red light always suggests warning. Tonight, it felt observational, like an eye that didn't blink. Outside air hit my face hard. Cold grounded me. Physical sensation helped. For a moment. The town sat under a low sky. Clouds pressed down without rain. Streetlights blurred at the edges. Depth stayed unreliable. Walking home felt slower, not because of fatigue, because awareness stretched time. Each step registered. Windows along the street reflected movement, mostly mine. Sometimes not clearly. I avoided checking twice. People talk about feeling watched. That wasn't it. This felt like being noted, logged somewhere unseen. My building came into view. Familiar shape, familiar steps, familiar door. Relief flickered, then stalled. Familiarity had started to feel risky. Harold had warned about that. Inside, the stairwell smelled like dust and cleaner. Normal, predictable. I let myself relax a fraction. Halfway up the stairs, I stopped. A sound traveled from above. Not footsteps, something softer. It reminded me of fabric shifting, clothing adjusting, a body settling, someone waiting. No one lived on the floor above me. The apartment had been empty for months, renovation delayed. Everyone knew that. I stood still. Listening sharpened again. The sound didn't repeat. Silence followed. My apartment door waited at the top of the stairs. Closed. Locked. Unchanged. I unlocked it and stepped inside. The air felt cooler than when I'd left. Windows stayed shut. Nothing explained it. Lights came on one by one. Corners revealed themselves reluctantly, nothing out of place. Still, my shoulders stayed tight. The window drew my attention immediately. Curtain half drawn from earlier. Glass reflecting the room. Depth layered again. I didn't approach it. Instead, I sat at the table. Distance felt necessary. Control mattered. The quiet settled around me, thicker than before. Not empty. Occupied without shape. Thoughts drifted back to Harold, to his careful omissions, to the way he described waiting, not as fear, but duty. Waiting isn't passive. It requires effort, endurance, attention without reward. I wondered how long he had waited, not in hours, in years, in habits formed and kept. The realization landed heavily. What if waiting changes the watcher, not the thing being waited for? What if that's the point? That thought stayed. It didn't frighten me. It explained too much. Understanding replaced fear. The window reflected the room steadily now. No movement behind me, no distortion. Just layered images. I stood slowly, approached carefully, not expecting anything, prepared anyway. My reflection met me at the glass, eyes tired, face drawn, recognizable. For a moment, something else aligned with it. Not a face, a posture, a suggestion. I didn't blink, I didn't step back. The moment passed on its own, as if denied permission. Breathing steadied. The room relaxed slightly. Whatever tension existed didn't escalate. It settled. That felt like a decision, not mine. Something else choosing restraint. For now. I closed the curtain fully, not out of fear, out of respect for boundaries, mine included. Sleep came later than it should have, light and uneven. Dreams shallow, awareness never fully off. When morning arrived, it felt earned. Morning light found the room without warmth. Gray tones settled on walls and furniture. Nothing looked changed. Still, the air felt used. Getting ready took longer than usual. Movements stayed careful. Habits adjusted themselves without asking. The window stayed untouched. I didn't draw the curtain back. That choice felt settled already. Some decisions don't need repeating. They become background. Outside, the town moved the way it always did. People walked dogs. Cars started and stopped. Life continued without pause. The normality felt distant, not false, just separate, like watching through glass. At work, the archive greeted me with its usual smell. Paper, dust, time layered in quiet stacks. The box with Harold's notebook waited where it belonged. It didn't pull at me the same way. Curiosity had shifted into something else. Recognition, maybe. I didn't open it. Cataloging finished earlier than expected. The work felt complete without closure. Some records closed themselves. Throughout the day, small things stood out. Reflections lingered longer. Silence carried shape. Waiting felt familiar. By evening, the understanding settled fully. Harold hadn't been afraid of what might appear. He'd been careful about what attention invites, about what noticing creates. I walked home slowly, not cautious, measured, aware. At my building, I paused out of habit. Listening came naturally now. Nothing answered. That was expected. Inside, the apartment felt different again. Not smaller, not larger. Defined. The window remained a boundary. Clear. Neutral. Respected. I realized then that the waiting hadn't ended. It had transferred. Learned behavior passes quietly, without ceremony. Harold had waited so others wouldn't have to. Now the knowledge sat with me, not a burden, a responsibility. That night, I didn't look at the glass at all. Sleep came shallow but steady. Awareness stayed present, guarded. In the days that followed, the pattern held. Curtains closed earlier. Listening came easier. Nothing escalated, nothing needed to. Waiting wasn't about something arriving, it was about keeping something at bay. Attention shapes outcomes. Restraint does too. I understood my role clearly now, not as a witness, not as a victim, as a holder. The archive gained a new quiet documenter, someone who knew which things stay unwritten, which gaps matter, which invitations remain unsent. The notebook stayed archived. The window stayed closed. The silence stayed balanced. For now, and every night, without fear, I wait. Story number 2. Damp paper clung to my hands longer than it should have. Although the building had been quiet for hours, something about that evening refused to settle. Tired in a way sleep never fixed, I stayed seated at my desk and listened to the walls breathe. Careful not to rush the moment, I let the stillness stretch until it felt thin. The place where I work sits far from any main road, tucked behind fields that flatten out toward the horizon. Because autumn had already stripped most color from the land, everything outside looked muted and distant. Used to long stretches alone, I rarely noticed the isolation anymore. That night, it pressed closer. I had been sorting through donated materials from an estate outside town. While most of it was ordinary, one box stood apart from the rest, marked only with a last name and a year. It felt heavier than its size suggested. Slowly, I brought it closer. Inside were loose pages not bound or labeled. Some were folded, others creased like they'd been carried around for years. Uneven and personal, the writing didn't read like a record. It read like someone thinking out loud. The name attached to the estate meant nothing to me at first. Because small towns reuse stories as often as names, that wasn't unusual. Familiarity usually came later, piece by piece. That pattern didn't hold here. One page mentioned a patch of land beyond cultivated fields, not described clearly, just referenced again and again. A place people avoided without saying why. Another page talked about evenings arriving early, the way sound traveled farther when crops were cut low. The writer lingered on silence more than events. That detail stayed with me. I leaned back and rubbed my eyes. Long days blur edges. Grief does too. Both had been shaping my weeks lately. The loss that followed me wasn't recent. Time had dulled its sharpest edges. What remained was weight. Quiet, constant, familiar. My habit had become staying late. Empty buildings feel easier to breathe in. No expectations. No questions. Outside wind moved through bare branches. It wasn't strong enough to make noise, just enough to shift shadows. I noticed myself watching the windows again. The papers mentioned a marker of some kind, not a grave, not a sign. Something smaller. The writer never explained its purpose. That omission felt deliberate, like avoiding a name or a memory. I turned another page. This one described standing still for long periods, listening without waiting for anything to answer, learning the difference between empty quiet and held quiet. That phrase caught. Held quiet implies intention, presence without action, awareness without movement. I didn't like how clearly I understood it. The building made a settling sound. Old structures always do. That didn't explain why my shoulders tightened. I stayed where I was. Across the room, the lights hummed faintly. Their rhythm felt off. Not broken, just attentive. I gathered the papers into a neat stack. Some instincts don't wait for logic. I slipped them back into the box. Not finished, but paused. The drive home took longer than usual, not because of distance, because my thoughts kept circling back. The land described in those pages felt too close to places I knew. Fields at night carry sound differently. Everyone who grows up near them learns that. What seems far isn't always. What seems empty rarely is. I didn't turn on the radio. Silence felt necessary, like part of the process, letting something settle on its own. My house waited at the edge of town, modest and familiar, lights off, windows dark, nothing out of place. Inside, the air felt cooler than expected. Seasonal shifts explain that. Still, I paused before setting my bag down. Listening had become automatic. The paper stayed with me even after I put them away. Not as images, as impressions, a sense of something unfinished. Sleep came late, shallow, interrupted by thoughts that didn't fully form. I woke with the feeling of having missed something. The next evening I returned to the box, not driven by curiosity, by obligation. Some stories resist being left alone. One page described a sound, not named, just compared to breath meeting resistance. Soft, repetitive, careful. The writer never claimed fear, They described attention instead. The effort of not responding, that detail mattered. I set the page down and stared at the wall. Grief teaches people to listen for echoes, to fill silence with meaning. I wondered how much of that was happening here. Another page mentioned children, not directly, only as absence, as something that should have been louder. The building creaked again. I didn't look up this time. Some reactions teach themselves. Awareness had already shifted when I finally stood. It felt like leaving a conversation unfinished. Not rude, just incomplete. I locked up and stepped outside. The night air carried the smell of cut grass and soil. Autumn always sharpens those scents. They anchor memories without warning. I breathed deeper than needed. On the walk home, I passed a stretch of land that matched the description too closely. Flat, unlit, unmarked. I didn't stop. Not yet. Some approaches need preparation. Some distances matter. Back inside, I made tea and sat at the table. Routine helps separate thought from impulse. Still, the image lingered. A small marker in a wide space. The papers never described what happened next. They ended without resolution. No warning. No closure. That absence felt intentional, like a boundary respected or enforced. I wasn't sure which. I realized then that this wasn't just about understanding someone else's experience. It was about whether I was willing to step closer to the edge of my own. Grief opens doors quietly. What waits beyond them doesn't always knock. I folded the last page and put it away. Not done, not finished, just not tonight. Outside, the wind shifted again. Branches tapped once against the house, a reminder maybe. Or coincidence, I turned off the lights and stayed awake longer than planned. Listening had become a habit, one I didn't remember choosing. Yet here it was. A low ache settled behind my eyes as the night stretched on. While sleep hovered nearby, it never fully arrived. Restless and alert, my thoughts kept circling the same quiet edges, careful not to force rest. I lay still and listened to the house. The sound of pipes cooling came and went. Nothing unusual. Still, each noise felt counted, as if the space around me had started keeping track. Morning came thin and pale. Although light filled the room, it didn't lift the weight I carried. Tired in a deeper way, I moved through the routine slower than usual. Coffee tasted flat, like it had lost something overnight. The box waited at work exactly where I'd left it. Unmoved, unchanged, yet it drew my attention the moment I walked in. I told myself I would finish cataloging it properly. Structure helps keep thoughts in line. Labels make things manageable. That intention held for a few minutes. The pages came back out. This time, I noticed the order wasn't random. Dates appeared only when distance mattered. Long gaps went unmarked. One entry described walking the edge of a field at dusk. No location given. No reason stated. Just the act of being there. The writer focused on sound again, how grass shifts when no one else is around, how the land answers itself. Those details felt practiced. I leaned back and exhaled slowly. Some habits form without intention. Listening becomes second nature, especially after loss. Grief trains attention. It sharpens senses people usually dull. Silence stops being empty. It becomes something to manage. Another page mentioned returning to the same place more than once. Not daily, not weekly. Only when the pull became too strong to ignore. The writer never described fear, only hesitation, the kind that comes before a choice. That distinction mattered. I closed the box again. The room felt smaller when I did, as if removing the pages had changed the air. That reaction stayed with me. By afternoon, clouds pressed low against the windows. Weather often mirrors mood without permission. This felt like that. Heavy but undecided. I left work earlier than planned. No reason I could explain. Just a sense that staying longer wouldn't help. Some days reach a stopping point on their own. The drive home took me past fields similar to the ones described, unfenced, quiet in a way that feels intentional. I slowed without meaning to, not stopping, just noticing. Awareness has its own momentum. Nothing stood out. No movement, no sound, yet the place felt marked. At home, I stood at the window longer than necessary. Glass reflects more at dusk. Brooms overlap with the outside. Boundaries soften. I step back and close the curtain halfway. Not fully, just enough to break the reflection. Balance felt important. Dinner came and went untouched again. Hunger didn't register the way it should have. Thoughts crowded out appetite. That worried me more than the rest. Later, I found myself sitting with an old notebook of my own. Blank pages hold potential. Sometimes too much. I didn't write. Instead, I traced the edge of the paper. Waiting. Listening. Recognizing a pattern forming. The writer in those pages hadn't been searching. They'd been responding. Returning when called. Learning when not to. That idea stayed with me into the night. Sleep came lighter this time. Dreams stayed distant. Awareness never fully shut off. The following day, I took a different route home. Not to avoid anything. Just to see if the pull remained. It did. The same stretch of land drew my attention again. Flat fields. No markers. Nothing that should matter. I parked farther away than I needed to. Distance gives choice. Approach carries weight. I stood for a moment before moving. The air smelled of soil and dry plants. Late season scents. They ground memory quickly. I breathed them in. Walking along the edge, I kept my pace steady. No rush. No delay. Letting the moment decide. The quiet here felt different from the cemetery quiet I remembered as a child. Less solemn. More observant. Like a pause held open. I didn't step into the field. Edges matter. They offer connection without commitment. I stayed there. A sound carried across the ground. Not clear enough to identify. Not distant enough to ignore. It faded before I could place it. I stayed still. Muscles relaxed instead of tightening. That surprised me. Fear hadn't arrived. The moment passed without escalation. No sign. No signal. Just awareness settling again. I returned to my car without looking back. Some instincts don't need testing. Respect works both ways. I drove home slower. That night I opened the box one more time. The last page sat at the bottom, folded differently, handled more often. It described leaving something behind. Not an object. An expectation. The relief that followed was mentioned briefly. The writer ended there. No summary. No summary, no lesson, just a stopping point. I closed the box and labeled it. Not with a category, with a date. Time felt more accurate. As I turned off the lights, the house settled around me. Familiar sounds returned. The space felt neutral again. Balanced. Still, something had shifted. Not fear. Not comfort. Understanding. Whatever waited in those open places didn't demand attention. It responded to it. That distinction mattered more than anything else I'd read. Footsteps echoed faintly somewhere beyond the edge of the field. Although the sound didn't belong to anyone nearby, it carried clearly enough to notice. Worn down by days of listening too closely, my body reacted before my thoughts did. Careful not to assume meaning, I stayed where I was and let the moment breathe. The land looked ordinary in the low evening light. Because autumn had thinned everything down, there was nowhere for sound to hide. Used to reading open spaces, I trusted what I could see. That trust felt thinner than it once had. I hadn't planned to come back so soon. Still, something about the unfinished quiet drew me out again. Uncomfortable but steady, the pull didn't feel urgent. It felt patient. The papers at the archive had changed how I listened. While nothing in them explained what to expect, they shaped how I stood. Alert, without tension, my posture softened. Waiting no longer felt like a mistake. The field stretched wide and flat. No markers, no paths, just space holding its breath. I stayed near the edge where grass met packed soil. Edges offered choice. They let you leave without consequence. I needed that. The sound didn't repeat. Silence settled back into place. Not empty, balanced. A memory surfaced without warning. My father standing still at the fence line years ago, listening to nothing in particular, content to wait. That memory grounded me more than logic could. Grief reshapes attention. It teaches patience through loss. I stood the way he used to. Wind moved lightly through the grass. Not enough to explain the sound from before. Enough to soften the moment. I breathed with it. Nothing arrived. Nothing asked. The field remained itself. That felt intentional. I turned back without looking over my shoulder. Some instincts arrive fully formed. Respect doesn't require proof. I walked away at an easy pace. Back home, the house greeted me without tension. Lights stayed off, windows reflected only the room. No layers. I made tea and sat at the table. Routine grounded the rest of the evening. Hunger returned quietly. Normal things mattered again. Sleep came uneven but deeper than before. Dreams didn't press for meaning. Awareness stayed gentle. I rested. Morning arrived without weight. Light moved across familiar walls. The day waited. So did I. A dull ache followed me through the morning without asking for attention. While chores filled the hours, my mind stayed quiet in a new way. Used to noise behind my thoughts, the absence felt unfamiliar. Careful not to disturb it, I let the silence sit where it landed. The house carried sounds I'd known my whole life. Floorboards responding to weight. Wind brushing the siding. Nothing felt counted anymore. Work pulled me into motion again by midday, and stayed busy. Focus returned in small pieces. Grief loosened its grip without ceremony. The memory of the field didn't fade, it settled. Like a stone placed instead of thrown, weight without movement. Late afternoon brought cloud cover, not heavy enough for rain. Just enough to dim edges. The light softened everything it touched. I found myself thinking about waiting again, not the anxious kind, the practiced kind. The kind that doesn't expect answers. My father used to wait like that, standing still without explanation. Letting moments pass on their own. I'd never understood it before. Understanding came quietly, not as a thought, as a shift, something settling into place. I returned to the house before dark. Windows stayed open longer than usual. Air moved freely through rooms. Nothing resisted. Dinner cooked without distraction. Simple food. Familiar steps. Comfort in repetition. I ate slowly. Not because I was cautious, because I was present. The difference mattered. Evening arrived without ceremony. Lights stayed low. Rooms felt balanced again. No corners pressed back. The urge to listen returned briefly, not sharply, just as habit. I noticed it and let it pass. The field didn't call again. That absence didn't disappoint me. It confirmed something instead. Boundaries had been respected. I sat by the window as night settled. Glass reflected only lamplight. No layered images. No suggestion of overlap. The quiet outside carried distance again. Wind far away. A vehicle passing somewhere unseen. Ordinary sounds. Sleep came more easily. Not deep. Not guarded. Natural. Morning light followed without weight. Routine resumed without effort. The day asked nothing extra. I answered in kind. Work passed uneventfully. Boxes labeled. Shelves returned to order. The archive felt neutral again. I noticed the old box once more, not with pull, with closure. Some things end quietly. The knowledge stayed with me, though, not as warning, as practice. Listening without inviting. Late afternoon brought clearer skies. Light sharpened edges again. The season moving forward. Nothing held back. I drove home along the same roads, fields passed without pause, no sense of recognition, just land being land. That normality felt earned, like balance restored, like a lesson learned without words. Enough. At home, I left the curtains open after sunset, trust returned in small pieces, not naive, grounded. I realized then that acceptance doesn't announce itself. It arrives when attention softens, when curiosity releases its grip, when living resumes. The waiting hadn't ended. It had changed shape, less watchful, more aware. I no longer stood at edges to listen. I passed through days instead, carrying what mattered, leaving the rest behind. Night arrived again without ceremony. The house settled naturally. Sounds found their places. So did I. A quiet confidence followed me into the next evening. Although nothing outward had changed, my body moved differently through the hours. Aware without strain, I noticed small things without assigning meaning. Careful not to turn attention into invitation, I let moments pass unexamined. The field stayed where it had always been. Wide, open, unconcerned with my presence. I didn't avoid it. I also didn't seek it out. That balance felt earned. Respect settled in place of curiosity. At home, the routines continued to rebuild themselves. Laundry folded, dishes dried, ordinary life stitching itself back together. Grief didn't vanish. It softened. Edges dulled without erasing the shape. That felt honest. I thought about my father again, but differently this time, not as absence, as influence. A way of standing still without expecting answers. Evenings grew colder as the season shifted. Windows stayed open just long enough to let air move through. I closed them when it felt right. Choice returned. The urge to listen never disappeared entirely. It changed tone. Less alert. More accepting. Listening became background again. Like breathing. Present without effort. Not something I measured. One night I stepped outside before bed. Stars scattered faintly above the fields. Distance returned to the sky. Perspective widened. I stood there for a while. Hands in my pockets. No goal. No expectation. The land held its silence. Not waiting. Not watching. Just existing. That was enough. Inside, the house welcomed me back without tension. Lights clicked off one by one. Darkness filled rooms evenly. Nothing lingered. Sleep came without negotiation. Deep enough. Restful. Undisturbed. Morning followed naturally. Sunlight where it belonged. Sounds in their places. Balance held. Days passed without markers. Work completed itself. Evenings arrived and left. Life resumed its pace. I noticed that I no longer replayed the pages from the box. Their meaning had settled where it needed to. Not forgotten. Integrated. The archive became just an archive again. A place of records. Not signals. Not thresholds. Occasionally I would think about open spaces. Not with pull, with appreciation. Knowing when to pass by. I understood then that not every quiet is meant to be entered. Some exist to remain untouched. To hold space rather than fill it. That knowledge stayed with me. The world didn't become smaller because of it. It felt larger, more complete, less demanding. At night, when the house settled, I no longer listened for more. I trusted what was present, what remained unspoken, what stayed still. Acceptance didn't feel like surrender. It felt like alignment, knowing where to stand, knowing when not to step forward. The waiting transformed into something gentler, not vigilance, not fear, awareness without attachment. I carried that with me quietly, into mornings, into work, into sleep. The field remained part of the landscape, so did I. Neither asking anything of the other. That felt right, and in that balance, without ceremony or final understanding, I stayed. Story number 3. A thin clicking sound kept repeating, like plastic tapping against glass somewhere close by. Sleep felt shallow, broken by the kind of rest that never fully arrives. Memory came in pieces, not the whole shape at once. Rain had been falling earlier, not loud, just enough to leave everything smelling damp. Fingers hovered over the edge of a notebook, waiting for a reason to move. Working nights at the regional archive meant long hours of quiet, and I had learned to fill them with small habits. Chewing the inside of my cheek was one of them. That habit always showed up when I felt unsure, even if I couldn't say why. Light from the desk lamp stayed low, aimed away from the windows. Although the building sat near the edge of town, very few people passed by after midnight. The place was old, all brick and narrow halls, built before anyone worried about how sound traveled. Every noise seemed to drift, soft but stubborn. Paper smelled faintly of dust and old glue. While cataloging boxes from a closed community center, I kept losing my place. Dates blurred together, handwritten notes looping into each other. That kind of drifting usually meant I was too tired, but leaving early wasn't an option. The clicking sound came again, not loud enough to scare, just present enough to notice. Something about it felt out of rhythm, like it didn't belong to the building. I didn't get up right away. Posters from the 70s lined the hall outside my office. Because the heating system had a mind of its own, some rooms stayed cold even in summer. I pulled my sweater tighter and listened. The sound stopped, then returned, slower this time. Standing felt heavier than it should have. Years ago, I would have brushed it off and gone back to work. Now, hesitation came first, shaped by a mistake I rarely talked about. Trusting the wrong moment once had cost me a job and a friend. The archive doors stayed locked overnight by policy. Still, checking them had become a quiet ritual. Keys rested in my palm, warm from my skin. The hallway stretched ahead, dim and empty. Footsteps echoed too clearly. Although I tried to keep them light, the floor answered anyway. That sound made the space feel larger than it was. At the far end, the side entrance sat under a small emergency light. Metal reflected a dull shine. While approaching the door, the clicking returned, closer now. It sounded like fingernails brushing something smooth. My stomach tightened without a clear reason. The handle felt cool. Nothing moved on the other side. Just darkness beyond the narrow window. I stood there longer than necessary, counting breaths. Turning back felt easier than opening the door. Because the mind looks for comfort when it's tired, I told myself it was the building settling. Old places made sounds. That explanation usually worked. Back at the desk, the notebook lay open where I left it. Dates stared back without meaning. Chewing slowed, then stopped. The clicking returned, now behind me. Chair legs scraped softly as I turned. No one stood there. Only the tall windows, black mirrors reflecting my own outline. Rain streaks traced faint lines down the glass. Glass shouldn't make that sound from the inside. Although the thought came slowly, it stayed. The clicking happened again, careful and patient. It felt like someone testing whether I would notice. Sweat gathered at the base of my neck. Writing suddenly felt important, like proof that time was still moving. Pen met paper with a shaky start. I wrote the sound down, then crossed it out. Minutes stretched without shape. The clicking stopped long enough for hope to creep in. That hope faded when a new sound replaced it. A soft drag, like fabric brushing the wall. Breathing stayed shallow. Because the archive held no security staff at night, responsibility rested with whoever stayed late. That night it was only me. Thought landed heavier than expected. Shoes felt tight as I stood again. Light from the lamp seemed weaker now, though nothing had changed. Every shadow leaned inward. I told myself to check once more and be done with it. The hallway felt longer this time, although nothing looked different. The air felt thicker. Each step sounded wrong, too slow or too loud. The side entrance waited at the end. Movement flickered near the window. Not a figure, just a shift in darkness. My hand froze inches from the handle. The clicking started again, right on the glass. Heartbeats counted themselves. That sound carried intention, not randomness. I didn't open the door. Instead, I stepped back, careful not to make noise. Silence followed. Not the calm kind, but the kind that listens back. The emergency light hummed softly. Somewhere in the building, something adjusted its position. I stood there, unsure which choice mattered more, staying still or moving away. The notebook, the desk, The long night all waited behind me. The glass stayed dark, reflecting only my shape. The clicking stopped, but the sense of being tested did not. The hallway light flickered once, then steadied. Although I waited for another sound, nothing followed. That absence felt heavier than the noise. It pressed into the space around me. Backing away felt wrong, like admitting something without proof. Because the archive ran on routines, I checked my watch instead. Time drifted, not moving forward so much as spreading out. The night felt wider than before. Returning to the desk took effort. Paper edges curled slightly under the lamp's warmth. Those small details usually calmed me. That night, they felt staged. Sitting down didn't bring relief. The chair creaked, louder than expected. Every sound seemed to announce my position. I stayed still until my breathing slowed. Memory slipped in without warning. Years earlier, I had ignored a quiet warning like this one. That choice followed me longer than the mistake itself. Regret has a way of resurfacing when rooms go quiet. A draft brushed my ankle. Because the windows were sealed, it made no sense. The air smelled faintly metallic, sharp and clean. Not like rain anymore. Listening became the only task. The building settled, pipes ticking in the walls. Underneath that, something softer moved. A careful shift, almost polite. Standing again felt automatic. Habit took over where confidence failed. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer. Its weight grounded me. The beam cut a narrow path down the hall. Although the light stayed steady, shadows bent around it. Corners looked deeper than before. Nothing stepped into view. The side entrance stayed quiet. Glass reflected the flashlight back at me. My face looked pale, stretched thin by fatigue. I barely recognized it. Turning the beam toward the floor revealed scuff marks. Not fresh, not old. Just enough to notice if you were already looking. They led nowhere clear. The clicking returned behind me, this time slower, measured like someone counting. My shoulders tensed. Spinning around showed only shelves and boxes. Because the archive stored donations from decades of closures, clutter filled every corner. Old chairs leaned against walls. Nothing moved. The flashlight trembled slightly. I hated that it gave me away. Light felt less like protection and more like an announcement. Still, turning it off felt worse. Footsteps sounded again, closer now. Not walking, more like shifting weight. The sound stayed just out of sight, always behind something. Backing into the desk, knocked the notebook to the floor. Pages scattered, whispering as they slid. That noise broke whatever restraint the room had left. The clicking stopped. Silence rushed in. Not empty silence, but full. Every surface seemed to listen. My breath sounded too loud. Bending down to gather the pages took longer than it should have. Hands shook, clumsy and slow. Dates and notes blurred together. None of it mattered anymore. The emergency light near the door flickered again. Although it stayed on, its hum deepened. That sound vibrated through the floor. It felt intentional. Standing upright brought a sudden clarity. Leaving felt like the only option. Staying meant waiting for something to decide. I didn't want to know what that was. Keys rattled softly as I moved. Because the main exit required passing through the longest hallway, my steps slowed. The building seemed to stretch with each one. Distance played tricks on the eye. Halfway down the hall, the air changed. Cooler, heavier. The smell returned, sharper now. Metal and damp paper. The clicking resumed ahead of me. Not behind this time. It came from near the main doors, blocking the only way out. Stopping felt safer than approaching. My flashlight beam wavered, then steadied. Nothing showed itself. Only the sound, patient and calm. Waiting stretched my nerves thin. Although my phone sat in my pocket, reaching for it felt impossible. Any movement seemed like an invitation. I stayed still. The clicking slowed further. Each tap spaced carefully. It felt like a question asked again and again. I didn't know the answer. Sweat cooled on my palms. Fear stayed quiet, controlled. This wasn't panic. It was recognition. A shape shifted near the door window. Not clear enough to name, just a darker patch against darkness. My breath caught. Backing away wasn't an option anymore. The hallway behind me felt closed off. Every instinct pointed forward, toward the sound. Taking one step felt like crossing a line. The floor creaked in protest. The clicking stopped instantly. Silence rushed back in. Standing there, caught between movement and stillness, time lost meaning. The door waited ahead, glass reflecting my light. Something waited too, just out of view. I held the flashlight tighter, unsure which choice would end the night. The flashlight beam steadied as my grip tightened. Although nothing moved, the sense of being watched didn't fade. The door ahead reflected a thinner version of me. Someone looked back who already felt older, breathing slowed by force rather than calm. Because panic wastes time, I counted the sounds instead. The hum of the light. The faint tick inside the walls. A memory surfaced without warning, not a clear one. Just the feeling of being told to wait somewhere once. Waiting had felt safe then. It didn't now. The clicking returned, softer than before. Closer to the floor this time, like knuckles brushing tile. The sound traced a small circle near the door. Stepping forward felt like agreement. Because standing still felt worse, my foot moved anyway. The floor creaked again. The clicking stopped. Silence pressed in from every side. Not empty, full of expectation. I stood there, caught mid-step. The door handle didn't move. Glass stayed dark except for my light. No face appeared, no outline formed. A second sound joined the quiet. A slow exhale that wasn't mine. It came from the other side of the door, too close to be imagined. Backing away brought the hallway back into focus. Shelves leaned inward, crowded with forgotten things. Every box felt like a witness. The archive remembered more than it showed. Turning the flashlight toward the shelves revealed nothing new. Old labels, faded ink, years pressed flat in the cardboard. The exhale came again, longer this time, patient, as if waiting for a reply. My mouth stayed dry. Words didn't feel useful. Sound felt dangerous. I swallowed instead. The clicking started once more, not on glass now, on metal, right under my hand. Jumping back knocked the flashlight off aim. Light streaked across the ceiling. Shadows shifted and broke. Something moved with them. Heartbeats grew louder than thought. Because the mind clings to order, I reached for procedure. Keys. Alarm panel. The panel sat beside the door, small and outdated. Its surface felt warm. Too warm. The clicking stopped when my fingers touched it. Holding still became instinct. The exhale vanished. The hallway held its breath with me. Even the hum seemed to lower. Turning the key made a soft click. Not the same sound. This one belonged to me. Lights along the hall brightened slightly. Relief tried to settle in. It didn't last. The reflection in the door changed. My outline doubled. Another shape stood just behind me. Not clear, not solid. Close enough to feel. I didn't turn around. Fear stayed quiet, focused. Some things become real when you look at them. I wasn't ready for that. The door unlocked with a final soft sound. Air from outside pressed in, cooler and clean. Rain smell returned. The other presence stayed still. Stepping through the doorway felt like breaking a seal. Light spilled outward. The shape behind me faded into reflection, or moved back. I didn't wait to see which. The door closed on its own. The clicking followed from the other side, steady, unhurried. Standing outside, legs weak, the building looked unchanged. Brick, dark windows, nothing out of place. My hands shook as I locked up. Keys felt too loud. The clicking continued inside, muffled now, like it had found its place. Walking away felt wrong, but staying felt worse. The night air wrapped around me. Rain started again, light and thin. The building listened as I left. Cold air brushed my face, sharp enough to sting after the stale warmth inside. Breathing came too fast, then slowed when I forced it to. Rain dotted the pavement without sound. The building behind me stayed quiet, as if it hadn't noticed my exit. Keys slipped into my pocket instead of my hand. Because turning back felt impossible, I walked away from the door. Each step felt borrowed. The clicking stayed inside, distant but steady. Streetlights cast weak pools of yellow. Although the lot looked empty, space felt crowded. Every shadow leaned toward me. My shoulders stayed tight. A habit kicked in without thought. Counting steps usually helped me calm down. Numbers blurred before 10. That failure bothered me more than the noise. Reaching my car didn't bring relief. Metal reflected my shape in pieces. Hands shook while unlocking the door. The sound echoed too loudly. Sitting inside felt temporary, not safe, just separated. The engine hesitated before turning over. Rain streaked across the windshield. Because the wipers squeaked, I turned them off. Silence felt easier to manage. The clicking faded as distance grew. Driving away should have ended it. The archive shrank in the mirror. White stayed dark. Nothing followed. Relief tried again. It almost worked. My chest loosened for half a breath. Then the sound came back. Not outside this time, inside the car. A faint tap from the back seat area. Plastic on glass, familiar and wrong. Hands tightened on the wheel. Looking back felt dangerous. Eyes stayed forward. Breathing stayed shallow. The tap repeated. Slow, patient, like it had time. Telling myself it was memory didn't help. Because memory doesn't make sound, fear sharpened instead. The tapping moved, closer to my ear. Still behind me. Streetlights blurred as speed increased. Rain thickened without warning. The sound matched my pace. One tap for every few seconds. Pulling over crossed my mind. That thought died quickly. Stopping felt like an invitation. I stayed moving. The back seat stayed dark. No shape appeared in the mirror, just the sound. Testing. Speaking out loud felt foolish. Words stayed trapped. Sound belonged to it now. I swallowed instead. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it started. Silence rushed in too fast. My ears rang. The absence felt staged. Driving continued without thought. Road signs passed unread. Rain softened again. Time thinned out. When I finally stopped, the engine was still running. Hands ached from gripping the wheel. The back seat remained empty. No marks, no movement. Stepping out into the rain felt unreal. Cold soaked through my clothes. The quiet pressed close. I didn't look back at the car. Standing under the streetlight made everything feel exposed. Although nothing moved nearby, waiting felt dangerous. The rain hid smaller sounds. That's worried me. Leaning against the car steadied my legs. Because exhaustion had been building for hours, it finally caught up. Eyes burned. Thoughts slowed. A memory surfaced without detail, just the sense of being followed once before. That time I had laughed it off. The outcome had cost me sleep for months. Opening the back door felt necessary. Not brave. Necessary. Light spilled across empty fabric. No marks showed. No scratches. Nothing disturbed. The silence felt practiced. Posing the door brought a faint resistance, like air pushing back. The latch clicked anyway. My stomach tightened. Getting back inside didn't help. The car felt smaller now. Every surface too close. I drove again. Rain eased into mist. Because the road curved through trees, light scattered oddly. Shadows shifted with the branches. They kept pace. The tapping returned. Not sharp. More like brushing, as if something adjusted its position. Pulling off the road happened without thought. The car rolled to a stop under heavy branches. The engine stayed on. I didn't turn it off. Sitting still brought clarity I didn't want. The sound wasn't traveling, it was waiting. Moving only when I did. Reaching for the door handle felt final. Air tasted damp and clean. Rain whispered overhead. The tapping paused. Stepping out broke the pattern. Sound vanished instantly. The forest held its breath. So did I. Leaves shifted nearby. Not footsteps, something slower, closer to dragging. Calling out crossed my mind. Because voices invite answers, I stayed silent. The rain masked my breathing. Darkness pressed in. The car light flicked off on its own. Shadows deepened. The space behind me changed. I felt it without seeing it. Turning around didn't show a shape, just absence where space should be. The feeling leaned closer, expectant. Backing away led nowhere. Trees blocked every direction. The road felt far. Time stretched thin. The tapping started again. On metal. Right beside my hand. Claiming its place. Cold crept into my fingers until feeling dulled. Because resistance felt pointless, movement slowed. The sound stayed close, unhurried. Breathing matched the tapping without meaning to. In and out, tap and pause. A shared rhythm formed. Looking down showed nothing unusual. Leaves, wet ground, ordinary things. Standing there, understanding settled quietly. Leaving the building hadn't ended anything. It had only changed rooms. The attention remained. The sound shifted again. Not louder, closer to inside my head. A soft pressure behind the ears, memories blurred together. Other nights, other warnings ignored, patterns repeated. Taking a step back felt optional now. So did stepping forward. Choice thinned until it didn't matter. The rain stopped noticing me. The tapping slowed. Each sound spaced wider apart. Waiting, patient. Hands lowered to my sides. Tension drained without relief. The forest stayed still. So did I. Accepting the quiet felt easier than fighting it. The sound softened further, almost gentle, almost kind. Eyes closed without command. Darkness deepened but didn't scare. Something settled into place, right where it belonged. When the tapping finally stopped, nothing replaced it. No relief followed, no fear either, just stillness. Story number 4. A hollow thud traveled through the wood, dull and patient, close enough to feel in the chest. Fatigue clung to me that night, the kind that makes small sounds feel heavier than they should. Memory never arrives clean for moments like that. Winter air pressed in from the cracks, unseen but insistent. I had been staying in a rented duplex near the river, a place split down the middle like it couldn't decide what it was meant to be. Working late hours at a small print shop had trained my body to stay awake when the rest of the block went dark. Biting my nails was a habit I never managed to quit, especially when I felt alone. That habit showed up before I even noticed the sound. The hallway light stayed off to save power. Although moonlight slipped through the front window, it didn't reach very far. The place felt narrow at night, tighter than it did during the day. Every step had its own opinion. The thud came again. Not loud, not soft either, measured like someone testing how much force was needed. Standing still felt smarter than moving. Because curiosity has a way of pretending it's harmless, I stayed where I was. The sound didn't repeat right away. Silence filled in around it. The duplex had been built before anyone cared about soundproofing. While neighbors usually bled through the walls with music or voices, that night held none of it. No TV, no water running. My breath felt too loud. Cold crept up through the floorboards and into my feet. The heater had shut off earlier, clicking itself into rest. Everything felt paused. Another thud landed. Same spot, same weight, closer than before. Fear didn't rush in. Recognition did, that slow sense of being noticed. I told myself it was the building settling. Old places shift when temperatures drop. That explanation had always worked before. It didn't this time. The sound came from the small room at the end of the hall. The one I used for storage because it never felt right to sleep in. Boxes lined the walls inside, stacked with things I didn't want to sort through yet. Closing that door had become a habit. My fingers found the edge of my sleeve and twisted it. Because pacing only made my thoughts louder, I leaned against the wall instead. Paint there felt cool and smooth. Grounding. A third thud followed, not stronger, just final. Waiting stretched thin. the kind of waiting that asks you to make a choice without explaining why. I didn't answer. I didn't call out. The door stayed closed, no handle turned, no hinge complained. After a while, my legs started to ache. Time moved sideways, not forward. The cold deepened. The silence listened back. Moving toward the room felt like stepping onto thin ice. Although I didn't want to know more, not knowing felt worse. Each step shortened the distance. Each step felt burrowed. The door looked unchanged, plain wood, a faint scratch near the bottom from a past tenant's furniture. Nothing unusual. I stood there longer than necessary, listening for breath, for shifting weight, for anything. Nothing came. Opening the door felt optional. Closing my eyes felt easier. I did neither. I waited. Another thud landed. This one lighter. Almost careful. My stomach tightened. The sound wasn't asking to be let in. It was checking whether I was still there, whether I was paying attention. I pressed my palm flat against the door. Wood felt warmer than expected. Not warm like heat, warm like it had been touched recently. Pulling my hand back sent a chill through my arm. The thud didn't repeat. Silence reclaimed the space, heavy and deliberate. Turning away didn't bring relief. The hallway felt longer on the return trip. Shadows leaned differently now, as if they had adjusted while I wasn't looking. Sitting on the couch brought no comfort. Cushions sagged under my weight. The room felt watched from the corner. I avoided looking there. Minutes passed without shape. My nails were bitten down before I noticed. The heater clicked once, then stayed quiet. Winter pressed closer. Another sound finally came, not a thud. A soft scrape, like fabric brushing wood. It came from behind me. I didn't turn around. Fear stayed quiet, almost respectful. Some part of me understood that looking would change things. I stayed still. The scrape moved along the wall, slow, unhurried, testing, breathing shallow. I counted heartbeats instead of seconds. The sound stopped when I reached 20. Silence returned, heavier than before. The room felt smaller. Standing up felt necessary. Because sitting made me feel trapped, I moved back into the hallway. The storage room door waited at the end. Unchanged. Light from the kitchen barely reached it. The handle didn't move. No shadow slipped underneath. Nothing explained itself. Another thud landed, closer than before, on my side of the door. The sound lingered after it landed like an echo that didn't quite fade. Although my body wanted distance, my feet stayed where they were. That hesitation felt chosen by something other than me. The hallway seemed to narrow. Cold air brushed past my ankles again. Because the windows were shut tight, it made no sense. The floorboards creaked in response, not from movement, but from pressure. I tried to remember when the room had last been used. Boxes had gone untouched for months. Dust should have settled evenly. Something felt disturbed. The door handle stayed still. No rattle. No turn. Just the space around it holding tension. A fourth thud came, lighter than the rest. Almost polite, as if whoever was there had adjusted their strength. Listening for a reaction, my mouth went dry. Calling out felt wrong. Silence felt expected. I gave it what it wanted. Standing there, memories surfaced without warning. Nights from childhood when houses felt too awake. Times when adults dismissed sounds as nothing. That old unease returned. The heater clicked once behind me. Although it stayed off, the sound broke something. The thud answered immediately, sharper this time. I stepped back without thinking. The floor complained under my weight. The door didn't move. The space behind it felt closer anyway. Reaching for the light switch crossed my mind. Because brightness often lies, I left it alone. Darkness felt honest. It showed where things chose to be. Another scrape followed. Slow, deliberate, right along the doorframe. My pulse thudded louder than the sound itself. Fear stayed contained, almost patient. This wasn't about being scared. It was about being acknowledged. I pressed my ear closer without touching the wood. No breathing came through, no shifting weight, just presence. The scrape stopped. Silence returned in pieces. The air felt thicker near the door, like it resisted movement. I backed away one step at a time. Because turning my back felt careless, I kept my eyes forward. The hallway stretched. Distance lost meaning. The living room waited behind me. Couch, lamp, familiar shapes. Crossing that threshold felt like escape. The moment I did, the thud sounded again. Not from the hallway, from inside the room with me. My shoulders locked. The sound came from the wall behind the couch. The shared wall, the one that lined up with the storage room. Understanding settled slowly. The door hadn't been the boundary. It had been the invitation. Attention had moved. I sat down without realizing it. Cushions dipped. The wall felt closer than before. Breathing slowed by force. Another thud followed, muted now, as if wrapped in something soft. Still deliberate, the room listened. No outside noise filtered in. Winter held everything still. The house felt sealed. I rested my palm against the wall. Paint felt cool, normal, solid. The thud came directly under my hand. Not hard, not threatening. Present. I pulled my hand back. The wall stayed quiet. For a moment, relief tried to form. It didn't last. A soft series of taps followed, not three this time, many, uneven. It sounded like fingers learning the surface, mapping, remembering, practicing. I stood up too quickly. The room tilted. Balance took effort. Fear sharpened. Backing away pressed me toward the kitchen. Light from the fridge clock glowed faintly. I didn't check the time. Time felt irrelevant. The tap stopped when I reached the doorway. Silence spread again. It felt watchful, expectant. I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes. Darkness didn't help. The house stayed present, listening. A final sound came from the wall. Not a thud, not a scrape. A gentle knock, 3 times. The sound settled into the room after it finished, like it expected a response. Although my heart raced, my body stayed still. Silence felt required now. Anything else felt rude. Cold crept higher along my legs. Because standing made me feel exposed, I sat back down slowly. The couch dipped under my weight. The wall stayed quiet. Waiting became the only action left. Winter pressed against the windows, muffling the outside world. No cars passed. No voices carried. I thought about the people who had lived here before me. Not their names, just their routines. Morning coffee, evening quiet, small habits. The taps didn't return right away. Minutes stretched thin, my breathing slowed without permission. The house seemed to breathe with me. A memory surfaced of my grandmother's place, how she used to speak to empty rooms like they were listening. At the time, it felt like a quirk. Now it felt like instruction. The wall stayed still, paint unbroken, no marks forming, nothing visible. My mouth felt dry again. Words formed before I chose them, soft ones, careful ones. I didn't raise my voice, didn't ask questions, just acknowledged the space. The way you do when someone stands too close. The room felt lighter afterward. Not safe, just less heavy. Like a pause had been granted. I stayed there longer than I meant to. Eventually, exhaustion outweighed curiosity. The couch became a place to rest. My eyes closed without warning. Sleep came in pieces, shallow and uneven. Dreams stayed away. Only listening remained. At some point, warmth returned to the room. The heater clicked back on. Normal sounds resumed. The house remembered how to be ordinary. Morning light crept in slowly. Winter gray softened the corners of everything. The wall looked the same as always. Solid, quiet. Standing up brought a wave of doubt. Had anything really happened? The question didn't last. My body remembered. I checked the storage room door in daylight. Nothing out of place. Boxes untouched. Dust settled evenly. The rest of the day passed without incident. Work. Noise. People. Night came again, slower this time. I left lights on longer than usual, old habits forming quickly. The couch felt safer than the bedroom. No sounds came from the wall. No taps. No thuds. Just quiet. Relief stayed cautious. It didn't settle in fully, like it was waiting to see if it was allowed. I didn't rush it. Days followed without repetition. The house returned to its routines. Creaks made sense again. Winter stayed outside. Still, I didn't forget. Some spaces change after they're acknowledged. Not louder. Closer. I learned where to sit, where not to linger, which silences felt empty, which ones listened. Even now, in different places, I notice it. The way walls can hold attention. How sound chooses where to land. How knocking isn't always a request. Some doors don't want opening. Some rooms just want to know they're remembered. And sometimes, 3 quiet knocks are enough to remind you. Not everything wants to be seen. The quiet held longer than I expected. Although daylight had softened the edges of the house, it hadn't erased the feeling. Something remained, settled in. It felt patient. I tried to return to normal routines. Coffee tasted the same. The sink still leaked a little when turned too far. Small things behaved the way they always had. The wall stayed silent. No taps, no thuds. That absence felt intentional. Night came back slower than the one before. Because winter shortens everything, darkness arrived early. I kept the living room lamp on. The couch waited where I had left it. Sitting there again felt familiar. Not safe, just known. The house seemed to accept that. I listened without trying to. The heater clicked. Pipes shifted. Normal sounds reclaimed their places. Sleep hovered but didn't land. My eyes stayed open, tracing shadows. The wall remained still. Too still. A memory surfaced of how the sound had changed when I acknowledged it. How weight had lifted just slightly. That detail mattered now. It felt like instruction. I spoke again softly. Not to ask, not to invite, just to notice. The room didn't react right away. Minutes passed. Breathing slowed. The house stayed calm. Then came the smallest sound. Not a knock. Not even a tap. More like a settling. The wall cooled under my palm. No warmth this time. Just solid presence. Grounded. Fear didn't rise. Neither did relief. Something like understanding took its place, quiet and steady. I stayed there until sleep finally came. Not deep, not dreamless, just enough. Morning arrived without ceremony. Light filled the room evenly. The wall looked unchanged. Nothing marked the night. I went to work. Noise returned. People filled space. The world felt larger again. Still, the house felt different when I came back. Not heavier, more settled, as if something had found where it belonged. I stopped checking the storage room door, stopped lingering in the hallway. The couch remained my place in the evenings. That felt agreed upon. Weeks passed without sound. Winter thinned. The heater ran less. The house breathed easier. I noticed I had stopped biting my nails. The habit faded quietly. Something about the waiting had changed me, slowed me down. Occasionally I thought about moving. The idea never settled. Leaving felt unnecessary. The house wasn't hostile. One night, much later, I heard it again. Not 3 knocks. Just one soft contact. Barely there. I didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't react. The sound didn't repeat. That felt like confirmation, not a warning. An acknowledgement returned. Equal. Living there became easier after that. Not lighter. Just balanced. Boundaries held. I learned which silences were empty, which ones carried weight. The difference became clear. Useful. The wall never knocked again. It didn't need to. Attention had already been given. That seemed enough. Spring crept in without asking. Light stayed longer in the evenings. Windows opened again. The house adjusted. I noticed how sound traveled differently now. Less sharp, more absorbed, as if something listened and let it pass. Friends visited once or twice. They commented on how calm the place felt. That made me pause. Calm wasn't the word I would have used before. I didn't explain anything. Some things don't need sharing. They lose shape when spoken aloud. This felt like one of those. At night, I still chose the couch. Habit had turned into preference. Sleep came easier there. Dreams stayed distant. Sometimes I rested my hand on the wall without thinking. Not to check, not to test, just contact. Nothing answered back. Nothing needed to. The absence felt complete, closed. I began to understand the difference between alone and accompanied. This wasn't company, it was coexistence, quiet and neutral. The storage room stayed untouched. Boxes remained sealed. Dust gathered naturally. Time moved on. I stopped imagining who might have lived there before. Names didn't matter. Stories faded. Only presence remained. One evening, during a heavy rain, the power went out. Darkness filled the rooms quickly. The house held still. I didn't panic. Sitting on the couch, I waited. Rain drummed outside. Inside stayed quiet, balanced. The power returned an hour later. Lights blinked back on. Nothing had changed. That felt important. I realized then that fear had been replaced, not by comfort, by familiarity. That was stronger. Whatever had needed noticing had been noticed. Whatever had waited had stopped waiting. The exchange felt complete, final. I never heard another knock. Not three, not one. Silence stayed true. Moving out eventually crossed my mind again. Life shifts. Places change. That's normal. But I knew something would stay with me. Not attached to the house, attached to listening, to paying attention. Some sounds don't ask to be solved, they ask to be acknowledged. That lesson stayed, quietly, years later, in a different place. I still remember that winter. Not with fear, with clarity. Like a line drawn softly but firmly. Walls sound different to me now. I hear intention in small noises, not threat, presence. I don't rush to fill silence anymore. I let it sit, let it speak first. That habit feels earned. There are nights when I wake briefly, unsure why. No sound explains it. No movement follows. I go back to sleep. Nothing ever followed me from that house. Nothing needed to. The exchange stayed where it belonged, in that space. What changed stayed with me instead. Patience, attention, respect for unseen boundaries. I still live in old places when I can. They feel honest, worn, used. Sometimes I rest my hand against a wall and pause, just long enough, longer than necessary. Enough. Most walls stay quiet. Some feel fuller than others. I don't question that. I accept it. The world holds more than we notice. Not all of it asks for fear. Some of it asks for stillness, for recognition. That night taught me how to listen without answering, how to stay without challenging, how to let something be what it is, without names. I don't wait for knocks anymore. If they come, I'll know what to do, I'll listen, and that will be enough.